Here we go. Okay, so again, welcome everyone to this installment of Faith in Context, Discerning Our Gifts for Climate Action. I want to welcome you all here, and I want to start us off with a prayer. So if you would, please pray with me. Gracious God, you are the one who calls us in all things to new life. And in this season of Easter, we thank you for the gift of Christ's new life that you give to your people. And we give you thanks for the way that creation continually renews and brings new life to us. As we discuss and talk about our gifts for climate action and what it means for us to be part of your creation, help us to see how you lead us to care for this earth and the way that you call us to care for it in an ongoing basis. Be with us all in our discussion and our learning, and give us faith and courage, and send us out with your Spirit to take action in your name for the sake of the world. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Well, I am very happy to invite our speaker for today, or to welcome our speaker for today. We have Kari Munn-Venn joining us, who will be presenting. Kari is the Senior Policy Analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, a national organization of members inspired by faith to act for justice in Canadian public policy. She coordinates CPJ's annual Lenten Faith in Action campaign called Give It Up for the Earth, and she convenes the advocacy group for the love of creation. Prior to joining CPJ in 2008, Kari worked in the international development community. She has an MA from Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and an honors BA in international studies and political science from York University. Kari is also a wool farmer at Leastone Farms, located on traditional Algonquin territory, West Quebec, where she lives with her husband and 3 kids. And Kari was also appointed to the task force that was formed by Convention Action in 2019 for the ELCIC to investigate our church becoming carbon neutral by, I believe it's 2050. And that report will be coming to our next national convention. So thank you very much, Kari, for joining us and for sharing your time with us. And I will turn things over to you.
Thanks so much, Bishop Jason, and thanks everybody for taking the time to be here this morning. I'm excited to be with you, and I hope that I can bring some information and some reflection and some ideas that will help us all sort of lean into our calling towards climate action. All right. So I want to start by introducing Loretta. Loretta is our llama. When we became farmers, we never had llama on the list of livestock we were looking for, but she's become an important part of our adventure here, and in a lot of ways symbolizes a lot of what we are intending to do. The principle that we sort of embraced when we came to Leastone Farms was nurture, that we want to seek ways to nurture the land, nurture community, nurture the plants and the animals. And as our livestock guardian, Loretta's role is very symbolic as well in terms of her role to guard and protect. I hesitated the first time I brought Loretta into a presentation because I thought, well, I wasn't brought on as a wool farmer, but rather as a staff person with Citizens for Public Justice. But I was in another event earlier this week, and somebody introduced Loretta before she introduced me, having heard about her in another session. So you won't forget, because not very many presentations start with guardian llamas named Loretta. Today, though, we want to talk about, I think, when I think about discerning our call to climate action, in a lot of ways it is, how do we collectively look to nurture, to protect, to serve the greater community and the environment and our climate. All right, there we go. Bishop Jason mentioned off the top that I'm with the organization called Citizens for Public Justice, and that we are a national organization of members inspired by faith to act for public policy. And a lot of the work that we do is in exploring the different ways that we can support and encourage public policy measures at the federal level that will help to support the creation of a more just, sustainable society, where the well-being of everyone is taken into account, where the flourishing of creation is prioritized, and we can create systems and structures within Canada that support the public good. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that CPJ is a membership organization, and as such, we have members from mostly people of faith from different traditions across the country. And part of that allows us to carry our voice in a way that is stronger, perhaps a little bit louder when we speak with political representatives about the work that we're doing. So if there's anything in what we are talking about this morning that gives you encouragement or inspiration, or perhaps a sense of hopefulness, and that you'd like to support CPJ's work, I would encourage you to do so. So yesterday was Earth Day. It was actually the 52nd Earth Day. It was started as a community event in the United States in 1970. And admittedly, as somebody who spent the last number of years working on climate policy, it's an occasion that I quite frankly struggle with a little bit. And that has to do with the fact that it becomes a moment where there is a lot of emphasis on park cleanups and totally drawing a blank, but a lot of sort of simple actions where we take a day to sort of say, okay, today we're going to look at what we can do to clean up in our neighborhoods and in our communities. And I hope, don't get me wrong, I think that those kinds of actions are important and that kind of engagement is good, though it certainly needs to go beyond a single day of the year. And so when I think about Earth Day, I also think about what are the ways in which we, and especially we as people of faith, can lean into this moment and this invitation a little bit more. Now, fortunately, Bishop Susan and her colleagues at the Anglican Church of Canada have given us some good pointers. But before I get to that, I actually want to sort of have a look at this word cloud that was created. And this was actually generated out of another event that I was recently involved in, where we asked people to think about what their hopes and fears were when it came to addressing climate change. And the words that you see on the screen here were all named in response to that question. And so I wanted to, I think we're a small enough group this morning, to ask if we might take a moment to have a look at this, to reflect on these words, and either out loud or in the chat, to share something that stands out for you, perhaps what the feeling is that it generates, and really, I guess maybe link to that what you hope we might be able to do either this morning or sort of in the longer term. So I wonder if, sorry, I'm struggling because I'm sharing my screen. I can't actually see the chat. But if folks want to maybe unmute yourself and speak to this question of, is there something here that stands out for you? It could also be, is there something that should be here that is not? But let's kind of open it up a little bit. And you might also want to take the opportunity to introduce yourself and where you're joining from. There it is.
Could you say again, Kari, what question generated these words?
What are your hopes and fears when it comes to addressing climate change?
Well, I'll say one of the things that I find, I don't know, a little concerning, I guess, about this is that, you know, the words go all over the place, like economic and emissions and, you know, policies, and talking about, you know, racialized people and all of these things. And I wonder if, you know, looking at it like this makes it too big of a problem that we're scared to even start somewhere. I mean, I love all of the words that are on here, but I wonder if looking at it like this makes it seem as big as the whole world.
Yeah. Yeah, fair point.
I'm David Lowe. I'm from Winnipeg, but I'm a Newfoundlander by tradition. And clean water just doesn't state enough to me. The oceans are dying. There's overfishing, and we're basically living an unsustainable lifestyle. We're depleting our resources too quickly, and so I don't see water realistically represented in this circle. And I don't see human activity and impact in terms of greed there. Like I see the economic stuff, but just naming it for what really is. There are 17 major fishing grounds in the world, and as of 1980, all 17 of them were severely overstressed and overfished. And the oceans are dying, and we need to do something about that as well. And that goes beyond just clean water, in my opinion.
Thank you.
I'm Matthew Deagle from Thunder Bay. I guess I'm kind of in the middle of what David and Bishop Jason have just said. Reading, as I read more and more here, it's like the news I saw this morning on Good Morning America, which was having a green environmental focus today for the rest of it, but it's just more of the same. It's almost like these words have become normalized. Like, I know these words.
Yeah.
And tomorrow I'm going to see the same words and the same words. So that's one of my fears when I see these words, is that it's continuing. And do we have any solutions? They didn't this morning, by the way, except for buying some green products, but that wasn't gonna, the green products weren't gonna solve these words.
Right.
They were more gonna make us feel better, I think, but that was good. But yeah, it's just the normalization of these words now. It's gonna be here tomorrow. So.
I'm Paul Sardison. I'm calling from Winnipeg. I actually was just struck by the words "just transition." I'm from Winnipeg, but I grew up in Calgary, and I don't really consider myself so much an Albertan anymore. And I've long ago left behind whatever attraction or devotion to the fossil fuel industry I might have had when I grew up there. But I also, having come from that setting, I also know that I think I'm very much aware of how the things we talk about and the things we talk about in terms of changes that we need to make affect everybody in different ways. And we always have to be considering all of these different ways that the actions that we take affect, even the positive actions we take, how those can affect people. And we need to figure out how to have just transitions, and how to have transitions that are, we know are to the benefit of everybody, but that happen justly as much as possible. So, yeah.
Thank you. And that's something actually I'm going to spend a bit of time on today.
Okay.
I think it speaks to the core of a lot of the issues that we're looking at.
Okay. Thanks.
I'm David Stroud. I'm speaking from Coquitlam, BC, and adding on to what Paul was saying, there are just transition struck me, as well as climate justice. And I was sitting here wondering about that word just and justice. what that means to what the truth really is there. What does it mean to the other people, like the indigenous peoples we have? What does justice mean to them? What does justice mean to the refugees that are coming into our country and massive amount of immigrants that are coming? What do they see as justice? Does climate justice mean the same to all of us? Or I was just wondering about that.
Thank you. They're good questions.
My name is Paul Garris, and I'm on Treaty 1 land and homeland of the Métis Nation, and I called to the ELCAC national office. And like the word that surprised, like kind of stuck out for me was rural, just by its very size, that it got mentioned so often in this context, which is, that's fine, just it was not expected. And the word that jumped out for me was squander as being an evocative word.
Yeah, thank you. Kenneth, I can see that you're unmuted. I don't know if that was because you were thinking about jumping in or.
No, I just shifted over to my finger. I think there are probably a couple of levels. I'm a retired clergy here in Winnipeg. You know, there's the personal level and the larger social level. You know, my mom and dad said to turn off the lights. You know, so there is something that we can control ourselves in our own households or in our own churches. I'm thinking about how we heat our homes, how we heat our churches. It can more be done on the personal level. And then, of course, the big social level, moving to a green economy. We need energy, but what kind of energy, what kind of initiatives and investments are needed to, you know, transition to a gentler use of the environment. So anyway, those are just a few thoughts that it does seem overwhelming at times. So as Jason said, you know, perhaps breaking it down personally and into something that can make a small difference anyway is, you know, would help us feel a little better about ourselves. You know.
In street ministry and in drug addictions and places like that, we use the term harm reduction. And like I keep hearing this phrase green energy, and it doesn't exist. What we're really talking about is harm reduction, not green. The number of acres and trees that are flooded for the Wacky Bennett Dam in British Columbia is phenomenal. The amount of birds that are dying and the bats that are dying because of the wind farms and the sounds and whatnot that they make hasn't yet been appreciated. We all know the cleanness and the dangers of nuclear energy, and we haven't really figured out yet what all the impacts of solar energy are. But like if you cover thousands of acres in panels, you're taking thousands of acres once again out of production, or at least out of any place where any of the green machines are. And like we're always talking about carbon capture. Well, the tree is the best carbon capture vehicle there is. So like I think we need to start talking not talking in terms of green energy, because that feels good, but start talking in terms of harm reduction. And how can we do less harm to what we're about?
Yeah, now I will admit you will see reflections on the shorthand that I have used later in the presentation is around greening the economy. But I hear you, and I know that that's something I'll take away to reflect on in terms of how we present. Now how we engage with this. Were there anybody else wanted to jump in before we move forward? Claire?
Yes, if I could just add to the word squander. There's been a lot of talk about zero waste and being a throwaway society. And that is something that I am concerned about. We've had about 5 houses on our street in the last couple of years being ripped down, and everything is thrown away. It all goes into a landfill. And there are a lot of usable pieces out of those houses that could be reused, but you got to get these houses built, so you got to rip them down. But also, I think that in some of our countries, we are also treating other economies as throwaway economies or throwaway people, because we are not protecting them. And we're using our consumer, I don't know, we consume so much, and I don't know whether we're really realizing how much that hurts other people. So there again, it ties in with harm reduction.
Thank you. One of you talked about overwhelm. Actually, I think a few of you mentioned that when we look at this, it can be really overwhelming. And I know that can be one of the challenges that we face in this current moment, is that it's so big, there's so much. And so to figure out those spaces that we can make a difference, where we can, not just do things that make us feel better. One of the most interesting things I think I heard years ago, Anglican priest and social work professor, the Reverend Dr. Michelle Lysak, talked about the psychological preparedness that taking personal action and sort of engaging in, whether it's buying green products or, the different sort of kind of up close and personal sort of things, that it actually serves in terms of the way that it prepares us for the broader systemic change that needs to come. And I found some solace in that, in knowing that that it is bigger than just sort of like, okay, well, I've recycled my newspapers, so I've done my bit. One of the places that I found some reassurance and some guidance in terms of how we can bring these things together was actually in the statement that Bishop Susan, along with the national bishops of the Anglican Church of Canada, shared for Earth Day. And what they said was, and this is just a part of the text that was shared. I think it was published on the ELCIC website on the 19th. But they said, God's creation is a sacred gift that we are invited to share in and to care for. Indigenous communities around the world are at the forefront of efforts to protect the lands they hold sacred. As followers of Jesus, we are called to do our part in sustaining the life of the earth we all share, to be active in caring for our shared home. We are also called to stand with those who have been particularly vulnerable to the impact of this ecological crisis because of colonialism, institutionalized poverty, and systemic racism. Partners in low-lying coastal areas, island nations, and Arctic regions have been sounding the alarm about the drastic impacts of climate change in their communities. We recognize this leadership and commit ourselves to working in solidarity towards our shared goal of renewing and sustaining the life of the earth. Part of what I appreciate about this statement is the way that it does bring things together. Perhaps in this particular section of the statement, it speaks a little bit more to sort of the intersections of a lot of the problems that we're facing. But I think in doing so, on the one hand, while it might seem overwhelming, it also, I think, creates space to consider how we might bring these issues together and address them simultaneously. And that's an important part of what I want to try to get to today. Before we do that, and my sense is that there's a good sense of, or a good level of understanding around sort of the situation that we're in and sort of where we're at. But I wanted to take just a moment to look at where we're at in terms of the climate crisis and how our federal government has taken action over the last number of years. So I've got an abbreviated timeline here, and it's not to say nothing happened before 2015 or these are the only things that have happened over the last 7 years, but these are just some I think really important and relevant sort of highlights to this recent trajectory. And so the starting point I wanted to name, of course, is the Paris Agreement that was formed at the end of 2015, where nearly 200 governments from around the world agreed to do what they could to hold global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, with making efforts to hold that to 1.5 degrees Celsius. One of the things that, or a couple of things that were interesting about the Paris Agreement was how quickly it was ratified globally. And so it was really by Earth Day 2016 that it came into force as a global agreement. The image on the screen is actually from last year's, and the Paris Agreement was formed at COP21, so the Conference of Parties, the 21st Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the image was from COP26, which was held in Glasgow, Scotland in November of 2021. The global consensus, I think, informed largely by Indigenous wisdom, but also by the international scientific community, as convened by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is that really the 2-degree target that was set in the Paris Agreement is not tight enough, and that we need to do everything we can to hold warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So that's sort of the context that we're in. And of course, there's all kinds of factors there in terms of who's being impacted and how how impacts are playing out. And we recognize too that even right now, where we are at slightly above 1 degree of warming globally, that we're seeing devastating impacts. I think of the heat dome and the wildfires, and then the flooding in British Columbia last year. But I know there's also all kinds of impacts. The massive snowfall that so many of you experienced in Manitoba just last week. Time is very strange still these days, but I think that's when it was, which, as I understand, it wasn't catastrophic, but certainly not what you would expect for the middle or end of April. So there's a lot going on, and I think the impacts that we're starting to see and feel are coming closer, both temporally and geographically. In 2019, just at the end of the spring session, so in June of 2019, the government of Canada declared a climate emergency. And in doing so, sort of set a framework to say, we're going to ratchet up what our efforts are to this effect. Unfortunately, the next day they bought a pipeline, and there are some questions there about how this all fits together. Our current government has taken the approach that they can do both at the same time, and that in fact some of the investments that continue into oil and gas will serve to help finance the just transition that needs to come. I don't think that quite lines up, but that's sort of the message. Then last year it was interesting because in 2021 we and the ELCIC and a number of organizations through For the Love of Creation, which is a national network of Canadian churches and faith-based organizations that includes some of the international development agencies of Canadian churches. So we came together 2 years ago on Earth Day 2020 to form this initiative called For the Love of Creation. And we did some advocacy and some campaigning last year that focused on really moving things forward in terms of Canadian climate action. And one of the things that was interesting was that there was some really good steps forward over the course of 2021. And yet at the end of the year, it was sort of a yes and. Like there's this really interesting and kind of terrifying challenge where it's, yes, we're moving forward. We're seeing progress in a way that we haven't seen before. And we're not yet anywhere close to where we need to be to ensure the livability of the planet. So two of the things that were done was that a year ago on Earth Day 2021, the federal government announced that they would increase our emissions reductions target to reducing emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. And this was up from the previous target of 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, but it doesn't yet line up with sort of what we would consider a fair share target of 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. A couple of months later, they also passed climate accountability legislation, which enshrines in Canadian law a commitment for the Canadian economy to be net zero by 2050. And what net zero means is really that we will reduce greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, and anything that cannot be eliminated will be offset either through carbon capture and storage or other tree planting. There's all so that it'll level out so that we are net zero by 2050. There were also important announcements related to Indigenous rights and global climate finance to the global South, which move things in a good direction. And then just about 3 weeks ago now, we got Canada's new emissions reductions plan. And this was linked to Canada's commitment to the Paris Agreement. And it lays out how our current government intends to reduce emissions to 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. A couple of things that were really significant here was that there is sort of a trajectory, and under the climate accountability legislation, there's a timeline which requires reporting. Because one of the things that has happened in the past is that there's a target over here, and actually until 2016, there was never any plan. So not surprisingly, we would never hit targets. Canada has yet to hit an emissions reductions target to date. But the clearer we get in defining how we're going to do that, I think the better our chances of success. It wasn't as far reaching as I think many of us had hoped for. And of course, it was followed by the federal budget about a week later. And the single largest line item in the federal budget was a tax break for investment in carbon capture, storage and utility, which is unproven and is, I don't think, what many would consider the most effective way to address the climate crisis. So it's interesting. Sometimes I think it depends on the day. Sometimes I can share this information and it kind of holds a sort of a hopeful tone. I recognize that right now that may be a little bit less so, but I think it is important to recognize that there has been important movements. One of the challenges I think that we face is that somebody earlier, when we were looking at the word cloud, talked about the language and the normalization of some of the words. One of the things that I find really challenging right now is that our federal government, they've adopted really fabulous language that suggests that they really get that we're in an emergency, that this is a crisis, that we need, significant ambition and action. But then there's this miss that happens between sort of the language that is being used and the plans and the action that is being undertaken. And I think that's a piece that we really, really need to address. And I think that's something where the church in particular has a really important role to play, because one, we have to unpack this with people that we know. And two, we need to continue to put pressure on government so that so that they know that we understand that this isn't quite cutting it yet, and that there is a lot more that needs to be done, and that this more ambitious action is supported. So I was glad, having prepared my slides ahead of time, that a few of you mentioned, in looking at the word cloud, climate justice and just transition. Because I think my sense of the current moment is that to look at a just transition is a really critical piece of how we can move forward, and not just addressing the climate emergency, but also a lot of the other challenges that we face. And I think that there's been awareness about for some time, particularly among impacted communities. But I think that through the pandemic, there's been a lot that has sort of been laid bare, and a greater level of awareness in terms of ongoing challenges faced by Indigenous communities, by racialized communities, by newcomers, and others. And I think that the opportunity that we have now is to actually to address some of these crises simultaneously. So, and my apologies, I missed closing quotation marks there. So when we talk about a just transition, there's sort of two fundamental principles that are included in pretty much any definition you'll come across. And that one, it's towards an environmentally sustainable economy and society, so that it's about a vision of a better, healthier, more sustainable future. But another really important piece is that the burden of change, and recognizing that this change will benefit everyone, but that burden of change is shared across society. And in labor movements, this is really about making sure that it isn't just the oil and gas workers who are forced to sacrifice livelihoods and a piece of their identity in terms of how they do their work and where they work and that kind of thing, but that it is something that we share the burden, recognizing that we're all going to benefit. I want to spend a bit of time now looking at sort of some various aspects of how we consider just transition, because I think the way sort of the questions that we ask will inform the answers that we get, and similarly the definitions that we use will help us understand where we're headed. So narrowly defined, a just transition would see workers that are currently employed in oil and gas and coal move into similar jobs in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, and in related fields that would be lower emission. And I think that is important, that workers certainly must be supported. But one of the things that's interesting to consider when we think about this narrow definition of a just transition is that most of the federal investments that have been made in supporting a transition so far go to white male oil workers with an average income of about $130,000 a year. They don't get to racialized communities, women, and others who often work in the periphery of fossil fuel driven communities, whose lives and livelihoods are also impacted by a shift in the Canadian economy, but because they are not directly employed in oil, gas, or coal, they are less likely to receive the benefits. So one of the things that we've at Citizens for Public Justice and also in For the Love of Creation have been working on, and this is also something that's been done across, I think, the environmental or the climate justice movement in Canada, and often in collaboration with colleagues in the labor sector, is to look at how do we widen that definition, and what are the implications? How does that, what would that look like? So, as I said, the first, sort of the most narrow definition is about support and skills training and income supports to people who lose their jobs in coal, oil, and natural gas. Widening it out a little bit then gets to include concern for workers, businesses, and communities in these regions that are often really concentrated, where the entire, this was especially true with coal, but also when you look at some of the oil sands regions and such, you see a lot of that concentration there. So to address the whole of the communities they're impacted and currently dependent on fossil fuel production. The third one brings it out a little bit more to integrate efforts to tackle climate change, but also look at how we can address inequality and other systemic injustices and their underlying causes there. We know that Indigenous people in Canada are overrepresented among people living in poverty. Racialized communities and people, especially people of Black people of African descent, are overrepresented among people who have struggled to get into trades and other well-paying jobs. And women, if they do get into these sectors, tend to be paid less than their male counterparts. So there's a lot of barriers in the current system that we need to be mindful of as we look at what we want to move towards. And some of the language here I borrowed from a colleague, Sister Sue Wilson, of the Sisters of St. Joseph's in London, Ontario. And the way that she widens this definition out furthest is to say that it's a moral issue, theologically rooted in an understanding of the sacredness of creation with its interconnected web of relationships. And I think that part of why this is so true, and that I hope resonates with people in the churches, is that it helps to provide a framework and I think some structure in how we address these crises and how we move things forward. To get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts, because sort of the theological framework is useful, but it may not help us as much as we need to sort of narrow in on what does this look like. And the international, one of the things that's interesting is, of course, that narrow definition focuses exclusively on workers. But even if we look to the International Labor Organization and the set of guiding principles that they've laid out, they encourage a broader consideration of what we mean by a just transition. And the first principle is that there be a strong social consensus supported by ongoing consultation, that there be an accounting for the gendered impacts of climate change, the establishment of a coherent environment for enterprises, workers, investors, and consumers. And I think this is really important because we're often part of the narrative that comes from, the government of Alberta, for example, though not only them, is that, we can't do this. This is bad for the economy. But what's interesting is that a lot of industry within oil and gas has said, we understand that things need to change. Give us the framework, tell us what the parameters are so that we can make our decisions accordingly. And I think that is sometimes overlooked when we look at it's sort of the oil and gas industry is pitted against environmentalists and others. But I think that all of us would do better to have some kind of clarity around what the rules and regulations are around this. One of the most important pieces or the most important principles that are included here is that we're talking about a shift to good jobs with adequate and sustainable social protection. So it's not just about, everybody who currently works in the fossil fuel sector moving into the gig economy or, doing work that isn't well compensated, but that there is a real focus on good jobs, and some would say good unionized jobs with adequate supports. And then there is also some recognition that we need to acknowledge national conditions. Unfortunately, I think in Canada, this last piece sometimes is used as justification. We're a large, cold country, so that means that we can't do things quite the same. And there is some truth to that. We do live in a large country that is hot in the summer and cold in the winter and requires a lot of energy to move us around. I think that it is used a little bit as sort of a crutch, because at the end of the day, and I think some of the comments that folks made early on, we are at a stage in this crisis where it's not optional. You know, taking action to reduce emissions, to address a lot of the societal inequities. It's not that, you know, let's do it if it feels convenient, but rather it really is about sustaining life on the planet. So if we look at sort of some of the definitions that Sister Sue provided, and also these principles from the ILO, and look at sort of what does this mean in Canada, and what are the kind of core components that are required in the implementation of a just transition, there are 4 things that come to mind. And the first one is that the rights of Indigenous peoples be respected and upheld. And this includes the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, as well as the broader framework provided by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And this was, as I mentioned earlier, there was some good progress on this last year, also in June, with the passage of the act to operationalize the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in Canada. And there's a time frame around that. I guess we now have about 1.5 years to put in place an action plan to make that happen. The second would be that we consider the well-being of people living on the margins. And so that when we're looking at the kinds of investments that are needed to help develop the kind of society and economy that we want, that it takes into account those who have been traditionally excluded from good, sustainable jobs, and brings them into the mix. And of course, within this, there are many racialized communities that have faced systemic barriers, especially in areas like the skilled trades and apprenticeships. Though I will say a lot of the language here suggests that we are talking about moving from one kind of energy production to another. But one of the things that I think the pandemic has also revealed is the real need that we have in Canada to sort of shore up our healthcare system, our long-term care system, on a lot of the care economy. And what's interesting there is nursing, social work, teaching, these are low carbon jobs. And if we can look at sort of what we're moving towards in this broader lens that looks at not just how do we get our energy, but how do we provide good employment opportunities for everyone in Canada, it needs to go beyond looking at just energy jobs. And yet the last point that I think is really important to keep in mind is that the livelihoods of oil and gas workers and communities be a priority as we explore a just transition. And I think that, being mindful of sort of where the lifestyles that people have built based on the jobs that they've had, issues of identity, like there's a lot of nuance that kind of goes beyond just making sure that there's funding for skills development and retraining. So I think those pieces are key. So there's a lot that's sort of in that, but my hope is that it provides a framework that helps us to think about how we can move and sort of lean into this idea of a just transition in a way that puts us in a better place than where we came from. One of the other things I might mention here is that early on in the pandemic, I think in May of 2020, there was a really beautiful sort of movement that emerged around the principles for a just recovery. And within about 6 weeks, I think there were about 600 organizations from a number of sectors, faith-based, social justice, environment, labor, community service, from across the country at different levels, that had signed on to these principles for a just recovery. And part of the impetus for that was that we saw at that same time various levels of government coming together and cooperating in a way that was really unprecedented. making resources available in a way that was also unprecedented. And of course, 2 years on, we can see some of the missteps are a little bit clearer in hindsight, and some of the old rivalries have reemerged, and the differences have been laid bare. So it isn't a situation that was dealt with perfectly by any stretch, but we saw a capacity among government leaders at various levels in Canada to work together and to respond to an emergency with emergency level responses. And so we know that it's possible. We know that there is, where there is a will, there's a way. And I think one of the challenges with the climate crisis is that it's still perceived as sort of far off and not as present. And I think that has been a bit of a challenge to how it has been addressed. So I'm almost done the talking part. I really look forward to getting into some of the discussion here. There's just a couple more pieces that I wanted to share. But really, the next piece is to look at sort of what can we, as people in the churches, what can our national churches and our collaborations do? And this is not at all an exhaustive list, but I think some of the ways that we can kind of lean into this work. And the first is that we can engage in the efforts of For the Love of Creation, which, as I said, includes the ELCIC, as well as about 34 other organizations across the country who have come together really in the interest of making a positive contribution in this critical period where action is required, and recognizing that we're stronger together. Many of us have worked on environmental and climate issues for some time, but by coming together, we think we feel that there's strength in what we're able to do. And there's a lot of different resources that are available there that I encourage you to check out. One of the things that I'm going to be doing afterwards is to be working with Bishop Jason and Deacon Michelle on a list of resources. So I'll make sure that all of the different things I've referenced, that at the very least you get links to websites and such. So For the Love of Creation is just fortheloveofcreation.ca. Earlier, folks were talking about the ways that we can look to change our work habits and our consumption, to look at ways to travel less and to use means of travel that are less carbon intensive, to look at how we can lower or offset our carbon footprint within our homes, within our churches, and at the congregational committee and regional national levels. And I'll circle back to that in a minute. There is a series of resources that were prepared by For the Love of Creation around climate conversations. And it's interesting because there's some times where we know that just talking about climate change is not going to address the problem. But one of the barriers that has been revealed through research is that a lot more people are concerned and interested in seeking change than are talking about it. And I think it was Paul who mentioned, that in Alberta, there's just a sort of an innate kind of affinity for the oil and gas sector, which I know is not universal, and it's part of almost like part of cultural identity. But there are a lot of people who do have questions, who are concerned and are interested in exploring solutions. And it's only when we acknowledge that and name that and lean into those conversations that we can help create the energy and the impetus that's necessary to move forward and to undertake the kind of action that is required. Another piece, and this is where, so this is most of my wheelhouse, is around engaging in advocacy. So it's not just about having conversations with your neighbor, but talking with political representatives, civil servants, your municipal councillor, your MLA, or your member of parliament to let them know that these are issues that are of concern and that you want to see action. And on that, I'm going to share a little bit in just a moment about an advocacy campaign that we run called Give It Up for the Earth. Another is to be a prophetic witness and to reflect faithfully on the relationship we all have to creation, to each other, and the way that God calls us to live in the world and to be in relationship, and to recall that we are covenant people, and that covenant is not just about humanity and God, but it is with all of creation. And then finally, though I probably suggest this might be a place that you start, would be to examine resources that have been prepared and statements by the ELCIC. And one of those would be the forthcoming report from the Task Force on Carbon Neutrality. And this is a project that I was privileged to be a part of over the last couple of years, working with members of the ELCIC to explore what it would mean for the church to become carbon neutral by 2050. And because of the pandemic and some of the shifts in sort of the convention structure for this year and next, this won't sort of come forward quite as quickly as we had anticipated, but as soon as this report is available, which could be in the Bulletin of Reports in May, though Paul Gers can correct me on that, I really do commend it to your reading, because it includes a lot of really practical recommendations around how churches and people in the churches can engage in the move towards carbon neutrality, which doesn't require approval from convention to get started with. So I'm a little bit biased there, admittedly, but I do commend that to your reading. And now I want to tell you about an advocacy initiative that admittedly I'm very excited about, but it's a project that I've run myself for the last 5 years, called Give It Up for the Earth. And this is something that we have put together at CPJ with the support of For the Love of Creation. And it's a program that has been run through Lent, though I really need to emphasize that it's not too late to sign on if this is something that resonates with you. We haven't closed signatures simply because we've passed Easter, but this is a campaign that we run annually that encourages people to consider what are those personal actions that they can engage in to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And again, that's often, that invitation is largely as a way to sort of enter into this, to broader consideration of the scale and scope of change that needs to be undertaken. But it also lends some integrity and credibility when we call on the federal government to take action to do more. Over the years, we focused on a number of different elements of addressing climate change, but the ask this year is that the federal government follow through on existing commitments to climate action. And one of the important ones there is to end subsidies to the fossil fuel sector, and also that they legislate a just transition that dismantles systems of oppression and inequality, by centering Indigenous rights, that promotes fairness and inclusion, and creates good, secure, green jobs. So the link is on the slide, and I will drop it in the chat in a minute. One of the things that we will be doing soon is hopefully meeting with Minister Guilbeault, the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change federally, to share the letters that we've collected and the expressions of concern that have come from people of faith from across Canada. We know that there are people engaging in this campaign this year in over 100 communities from most major Christian denominations. And we hope it's something that will resonate. I know we have some Lutheran congregations that have already been involved, but we hope this is something that will resonate with you as well. So all of that, and now I have one slide, though it is bigger than I think a lot of these other pieces, which is really where I want us to spend the rest of our time today. And this is around discerning how each of us are called to engage in climate action. And one of the things that I think is really beautiful about this process that was put together by, I think she's an ocean scientist, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson in the US, is that it can serve to address some of the overwhelm in that we are invited to do our piece in our place with the time and the skills and the energy that we have, recognizing that others are doing the same where they are. So I'd love to take a few moments. I invite you, if you have a piece of paper handy, to draw this Venn diagram. I don't know if because I'm, well, Venn is part of my last name, that I'm particularly drawn to Venn diagrams, but I feel like they're really useful tools sometimes in thinking through things. And so as you can see on the screen, the three circles or the three questions that we have is what is the work that needs doing? And we have, even before I started, named a lot of the challenges that we face and the work that does need to be done to address the climate crisis. So what's, understanding what some of the big pieces are there. What skills do you bring? What gifts do you have? What interests and abilities can you apply to this? What are you good at? And then the third one, which I think we sometimes forget in our effort to get things done and achieve the results that we need, and but to look at what brings you joy, where and how can you engage in a way that feeds your heart, that lifts your spirit, and that offers hope that I think is so desperately needed. I think it may be worth saying that I know for a long time when I thought about advocacy, it was always sort of outward facing to the government, to our leaders. But I think there's a really important role that we can play as sort of the people in the pews in encouraging the leaders in our congregations to engage with these issues as part of our worship, a part of our, when we looked at lament and all of the different pieces, because I think that far too often there is a lot of separation between sort of what we might think about climate change and how it engages with our spirituality. And I think, and I say this not just because Paul Gers is on the call, but I think that the national leadership of the ELCIC has done a good job at speaking into many of these crises. I don't know how well known some of these efforts and some of this the reflection is among people in the pews. And that's not just about Lutherans, but I see that in a number of different denominations in Canada. But so I think that if these are issues that, and I agree, David, that they are matters of spirituality, I think it's important that we encourage those who lead worship where we are to make sure that they are central and present in our worship.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna share my screen again just for a second to share a couple last slides. One of which that same 10-year-old thinks is kind of silly, but I'm going to share it anyway. So one of the things I mentioned earlier, the idea of conversation and dialogue. And I think that throughout the conversation, a lot of what we've talked about has to do with community and collective. And I think as we sort of wrap up today, I think that it's important to remember that we're all in this together, and the kind of future that we create is collective. And it's not to say, certainly there are some in our society that are more negatively impacted if we get this wrong. But there are ways, I think, that we can go about this that would mean that we would all be able to have our rights respected, our well-being supported, and to really live into the flourishing of all creation that we're a part of. And I think that a really important piece about that is really to spend probably more time listening than we spend talking, but also to ensure that we are sharing our experiences and our concerns and our questions and our ideas and our vision, and that we continue to be in dialogue with the people that we know, with people that we might not yet know, with people in positions of leadership and power, so that we can live into that vision. Because every change we create is created in relationship, and it's created in community. And I'm mindful, I mentioned earlier how heavy these conversations can sometimes be. And so I did want to, I think, because I think recognizing the hopefulness and the levity is important, but I wanted to just share one last image. And this is from my dear sheep, Hope. And I said to my daughter, Naomi, today, I really feel like I need to end on a hopeful note. And I showed her this and she said, Mommy, why do you say things like that? I think it may be classified as a dad joke, but maybe moms make dad jokes too. So, but with that, I wanted to just say thank you for sharing your Saturday morning with me, for your time, your attention, your thoughtful questions, and I wish you well in your discernment, individually and corporally as we go forward into the future.